Welcome to the Community Climate Hub Fall Webinar Series. And for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to the Community Climate Hub Initiative. My name is Alexa Belui, Research Intern with the Climate Reality Canada, focusing on urban agriculture and electric vehicles. Through several trainings each year with Al Gore, including in Denver and Seattle earlier this year, and in Pittsburgh in 2 weeks, the Climate Reality Project trains leaders to share the urgency of and solutions to climate change. We're also helping create community climate hubs throughout the country that will help raise the bar on climate action in Canadian cities while spurring ambition at the provincial and federal levels. This webinar is the fourth in our fall series, which you can see listed on your screen. Sign up for the upcoming webinars at climatehub.ca. These webinars are meant to exchange best practices and tools that you can leverage in your own cities to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. Today's webinar does just that. Jason Dion is a research associate with Canada's Ecofiscal Commission, a group of economists devoted to environmental policy that is both good for the environment and the economy. His work at the Commission focuses on climate policy in Canada. In economists. At the Institute for Sustainable Development, where his work focused on climate change mitigation and adaptation, green public procurement, and sustainable infrastructure. Jason is a graduate of the MA Economics program at York University with a focus on ecological economics. Following Jason's presentation, Chad Townsend, environmental manager at the town of Banff, Alberta, will join us to answer questions posed and the feasibility of proposed ecofiscal solutions given municipal competencies. Chad holds a European Masters of Applied Ecology and is a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners. He has assembled a variety of unique perspectives from living in jurisdictions considered innovative pioneers in environmental practices, like Finland, Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, and Bolivia. In his current role as part of the Tourism and the Environmental Balancing Act in famous Banff National Park, Chad works on projects related to renewable energy, active transportation, pollution prevention, waste diversion, and land use planning.
Great, thanks very much, Alexa. I assume everyone can hear me. Okay, so I'm going to be giving a presentation today about ecofiscal policy, how to complement federal and provincial climate policies at the local level. So just to give a bit of an overview, we'll just start with a little bit of context, kind of talking about Ecofiscal's work on this topic. And we're going to talk about how municipalities, can support carbon pricing. And we're going to talk about two main aspects of that. One, the rationale for the policies that they might institute, and two, interactions between those policies and carbon pricing. And then we'll close with a short summary and then take questions after that. So supporting carbon pricing is a report that came out from the Ecofiscal Commission in June of this year. And it was our third major report on climate policy. So the first, the way forward, was about carbon pricing options and why they're the most economically efficient way to reduce Canada's emissions. Second was choose wisely, which was about what you can do with the revenue that's raised from carbon pricing. So you end up with a lot of public revenue from a cap and trade system or a carbon tax. So there's different things you can do with it. So that report took on what those are and why different options might make sense. And then third, our report supporting carbon pricing was intended to answer the question, okay, so if Canada has carbon pricing coming next year, what else? What else might make sense in addition to carbon pricing? Canada has an ambitious emissions reduction target for 2030, and carbon pricing is probably only going to get us part of the way there. So this question about what else was kind of front and center, and that's what this report was intended to take on. So before we really jump into it, I just wanted to start with a poll question. So I believe on the side of your panel, you'll see a place to answer this question. So I'm curious to hear from the participants, what balance of pricing and non-pricing climate policies do you think is needed? So is it a matter of all carbon pricing and nothing else? Is it carbon pricing with a limited number of these other policies? or carbon pricing plus a lot of these other policies. So we'll come back to those results in a bit. So the kind of key questions for the purposes of this presentation is, one, what types of non-pricing policies might make sense in addition to carbon pricing? And two, what types of policies should municipal governments in particular focus on? So just for a little bit of context, just to kind of explain what I mean when I say non-pricing climate policies, we're basically including anything that limits GHG emissions that isn't carbon pricing. So here we've got a few kind of random examples. So in the electricity sector, it could be things like renewable energy credits, renewable portfolio standards. It could be something in the forestry sector, enhancing carbon sequestration in forests, building codes, landfill diversion targets like Ontario has. So these are some examples that we've drawn from the appendix of our report. They're mostly provincial or federal in scale, but they give you a sense of the types of things that we're talking about. So we're talking about regulations, policies, subsidies that aren't carbon pricing, but do lower emissions. So in our report, we've developed a kind of comprehensive framework for assessing non-pricing climate policies. So how it provides a way for people to evaluate and think about the merits of different policy options. So it has 5 steps in it, or 5 kind of key questions that it helps to answer. One, what is the rationale for the additional policy? So why is that policy in particular needed? 2, how does it interact with carbon pricing? Does it interact in a way that's helpful or not helpful? 3rd, how is the policy designed? Is it designed in a way to get good performance? 4th, is it effective? Does it reduce GHG emissions effectively? And finally, 5th, is it cost effective? Does it reduce those emissions in a way that is cost effective? So in this presentation, I'm really going to only focus on the second questions, the first 2 questions, sorry. If anybody is curious to kind of learn more about the other 3 questions, I'd encourage you to take a look at our report on our website. So this first question of the rationale for a non-pricing policy, in our report, we detailed that there are basically 3 types of rationales that a policy can have. And any policy that doesn't have one of these types of rationales is not a good complement to carbon pricing. You're better off with a different policy or just more carbon pricing. So those policies, we've kind of given them each kind of interesting little names in the report. So first of all, you've got a gap filler. So a gap filler is a policy that addresses GHG emissions that aren't covered by carbon pricing. So carbon pricing doesn't cover the entire economy, the entire emissions inventory. So policies that go after the gaps can make sense. So an example there would be capturing methane emissions from landfills. That's not something that would be affected by carbon pricing. So that can be a good rationale, this gap filling policy. Second is a signal boosting policy. So there might be problems in the market, barriers or market failures that get in the way of carbon pricing. So carbon pricing sends a clear signal to consumers and producers that they might want to limit their use of carbon in this one area or just pay the tax, but sometimes things can get in the way. So a classic example there is EV charging network infrastructure, that the carbon price signal might make me more likely to buy an electric vehicle. But if I don't think that I'm going to be able to conveniently charge it, then I might be a little more reluctant. So you've got a bit of a chicken and egg problem there. So a good policy might be to build out that network to make it more likely for the carbon price to do the work of encouraging people to get electric vehicles. So a signal boosting policy can be another rationale. Third, you can have a benefit expanding policy. So this is a policy that achieves both GHG mitigation and other objectives. So an example there would be measures to improve urban walkability. So with that, to the extent that it gets people out of their cars, it might be lowering GHG emissions, but urban walkability is a desirable outcome in itself. So with a policy like that, you're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. So these 3 rationales are the reasons why you might want to pursue a non-pricing climate policy. So I'll return to these a little bit later on in more detail, but next I just wanted to talk about that second question of interactions. So interactions with the carbon pricing system are important to think about. So you've got 2 basic approaches to pricing carbon: carbon tax and cap and trade. So in Alberta and British Columbia, you currently have carbon taxes, whereas in Ontario and Quebec, you have cap and trade. And under this new pan-Canadian climate framework, provinces are free to pick whichever approach they think makes the most sense for them. So you're going to have different types of instruments in different places. And the way that your policies interact with the instrument that you have in your province is important to consider. So carbon taxes are a little simpler. They when you have a complementary policy and a carbon tax, they can support each other. Whatever GHG mitigation you get out of your policy is going to be additional to whatever your carbon tax policy would have done. But it doesn't necessarily work that way with cap and trade. So under a cap and trade system, when the complementary policy and the cap and trade are going after the same emissions, it means that the mitigation, the limited emissions that you're going to get out of your policy aren't necessarily going to be additional to what your cap and trade system would have gotten you alone. So it's kind of the reason why is a little bit tricky. So I'll just kind of get into it a little bit on this next slide. So kind of to reiterate, complementary policies and cap and trade systems can overlap with each other, and that's when you can potentially have a problem. So this is a quote from a blog that our research director wrote a few months ago that kind of explains why, and so I'll just read it out. So the number of permits in a cap and trade system defines the level of allowable emissions, i.e. the cap. An additional policy might reduce emissions in a specific sector, but because the system's overall cap hasn't changed, these new reductions will just displace reductions that would have happened somewhere else. And this is the part that kind of puts it well, I think. So think of it like a balloon. The total volume of air, or the level of allowed emissions, is fixed. As a result, when you squeeze one end of the balloon, one end just bulges out. So you don't get a smaller balloon in the end, you just get kind of emissions moving around. And that's the way it works in a cap and trade system, is the policy that you might institute might lower emissions in the area it's intended to, but because the total allowed cap of emissions hasn't changed, those different emissions might pop up somewhere else. So this interaction effect is really important to consider. So when a municipality is in a province using cap and trade, it should think carefully about whether its GHG policy is a good complement to that carbon pricing system. And questions to ask are, is it more costly than the thing it might have displaced? And if it is there still a good argument in favor of it? And that gets back to the rationale. So if the policy is a benefit expanding policy, if it does other things, then it still might be worth it, even though it's a little bit more costly. Now, these interaction effects are something that carbon tax provinces need to consider as well, but it's more important in a cap and trade system because of that potential to displace. So kind of a key and kind of subtle point that is important to think about in interactions. And we have some blogs on this topic if anyone's curious to take a look at our website. So now we'll return to this concept of rationales. And I'm going to talk in detail a little bit about what types of sectors you might see a rationale, a given type of rationale in, and what kind of municipal policies might therefore make sense. So a gap filler, again, is a policy that covers GHG emissions that aren't covered by a carbon price. So some sectors where you're typically not going to see carbon pricing covering them are land use and waste. And these are two sectors that obviously municipal governments have quite a bit of say over. So some possible municipal policies in this area are urban green space and green belts. So when you're growing forests or protecting forests, there's carbon sequestered in there, and that's not going to be affected by carbon pricing. So policies that go after that can make sense. Recycling programs or organic composting programs can make a lot of sense. Landfilling is very GHG intensive. So if you're able to divert some of that waste flow, it can lower GHG emissions, but these are sources of emissions that aren't covered by carbon pricing. So going after them at the municipal level can make a lot of sense. They're also pursued at the provincial level, I should add. And related to that is methane capture from landfills. So when you've got organic wastes decomposing in landfills, you get methane. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, 25 times more powerful than CO2. But it's also possible to capture that methane at the landfill and to burn it off instead, which has less of a greenhouse gas effect. So policies that go after methane in landfills can be an important type of gap filling policy at the municipal level. So these are just a few examples. Now, signal boosting policies are when you have a policy that helps the carbon price work better by going after market problems. So some common areas where we see market problems getting in the way of what we sort of expect should be cost-effective GHG reductions are electric vehicles. So I talked about that a bit earlier. Net zero buildings, land use and development patterns, and public budgets, which is sort of a different example, that it's not necessarily one where market forces rule, but to the extent to which public procurement officials are focused on buying the cheapest good, that might bias them away from the less emissions intensive good that might be preferable if you kind of took a broader perspective. So kind of building on that, some areas that might make sense for signal boosting policy at the municipal level are electric vehicle charging stations, building codes. So the city of Vancouver has been quite a leader on net zero building codes. So looking at how you build houses that have a net zero GHG balance year over year. Also policies around zoning, densification, and at the procurement level. So what the city purchases is also really important. So maybe instead of buying a kind of fossil fuel powered bus, they could get electric buses. And so these sorts of decisions are important to consider. And maybe there's also some scope for the public procurement and the city to act as kind of a leader in this way, that they're kind of acting as a guaranteed buyer of some of these products to help kind of jumpstart the industry. So there's some good arguments there for doing that sort of thing. And another interesting one is water infrastructure. So Ecofiscal has a report that just came out a month ago on municipal water services and pricing those. And one thing that we learned in the process of doing that is a third to half of the average municipality's energy bill is spent just pumping water around the city. And a lot of these systems are old and leaky. And to the extent to which you can build them better, you can reduce your energy bill. So these kind of procurement public spending areas can be an important area of signal boost policy as well. So finally, there's also the rationale of a benefit expanding policy. So this is a policy that gets you GHG mitigation and something else at the same time. So some common types of co-benefits in GHG policy are when you're doing things around infrastructure, livable communities, quality of life, you're likely to get GHG mitigation and some of these things at the same time. So it can be important for governments to consider that at the municipal level. So some possible municipal policies that would be benefit expanders are public transit, walking and cycling infrastructure. So with those, I mean, you're getting GHG mitigation, right? You're getting less emissions, but you're also making cities more, making transport within cities more efficient, which is a desirable outcome in itself. So that's a type of co-benefit policy that might make sense at the municipal level. Another one, and this is more one for big cities, is congestion pricing. So that's pricing use of cars, use of certain bridges, that sort of thing, or using the roads at certain times of day in a way that sends a price signal that people realize, okay, maybe if I can change my habits a little bit, I can avoid driving at that time and save some money. But the benefit of reducing congestion is also that you reduce all that idling, everyone just sitting there, and lots of emissions going up as a result. But this is also a co-benefit area because everybody hates congestion, and you can make a city much more economically efficient. Transport gets a lot better with a policy like congestion pricing that can also offer GHG co-benefits. So these three types of rationales are kind of the reasons that you might pursue non-pricing policy. So we'll just ask another poll question. I'm curious to hear the thoughts of the participants. You know, given what I've just described about these three policies, which types of policies do you think governments should focus on? So before I kind of get to that question, here we have the results from the earlier poll. So 10% believe that all carbon pricing is enough. 30% think that there's a room for some carbon pricing with a little bit of these other policies. But we have most of the participants saying carbon pricing plus a wide range of non-pricing policies. So really interesting result. And I would sort of add that, you know, I'm not even sure what I think about this question. From our perspective at Ecofiscal, it's more about making sure that the additional policies you have are cost effective and a good support to carbon pricing. And what that adds up to in the end, in terms of the balance between the two, is, for, you know, to a certain extent kind of beside the point. So, but interesting result. And overall, I would say I kind of tend to agree probably with the result that we saw. So moving to the next poll question, you know, given what I've described, which types of policies do you think are most important? And the question is phrased in terms of government, but I think let's kind of think about it in the municipal context. So what types of policies should municipal governments be focused on? Is it one of those three or all of the above? So I'll just kind of offer a bit of a summary and a final note before we kind of move to questions. So really there's three main things to watch for. So people who are going to be kind of advocating for climate policy at the municipal level or asking tough questions about what's being done at the municipal level, there's kind of three main areas that you want to be thinking about. One, does the policy have a clear rationale? Is it a gap filler, a signal booster, or a benefit expander? And why is it under that category? So important to think about in terms of why the policy is needed. Second, are there interactions with carbon pricing that you need to be concerned with? So if the GHG emissions that you reduce are just going to pop up somewhere else, does the policy still make sense? Are there other arguments still in favor of it? So important to think about that. And third, we didn't really get into this. I'd encourage you to take a look at the report for more on this. Is the policy well designed? So this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. And when you're talking about a specific policy, there's a number of questions you can ask about the way it's designed. Is it designed in a way that's going to really improve performance? So these questions are, of course, important to consider, but they're not enough. So really what you really want to ask at the end of the day, and our report provides a lot of guidance on this, and really kind of our report was at a policy-making audience. For those kind of engaged on municipal policy at an advocacy level, maybe these questions aren't as, it's more about the first three. But at the end of the day, these final ones matter. Is the policy effective? How much GHG does it reduce? And second, is it cost effective? Is the cost of those reductions coming at a fair price? Now, that's a really tough question to answer in terms of what the right cost for reducing emissions is. And we provide some information on that on our report. But these three questions, I think, are really front and center, and especially the first two, rationale and interactions. So I believe that's, oh, right, one more slide. So the kind of takeaway in all of this, the recommendation that Ecofiscal would make on this topic is that municipalities should focus on policies that are in their sphere of influence. So there are areas where municipalities are kind of the only game in town, and it makes sense to focus there. And you want to focus on the policies that can best complement carbon pricing. So that, there's some tough questions to ask around what those policies are. So our report, as I said, provides more information on this. We've also got a summary infographic that you can kind of half see. It's maybe a little blurry at the right. So if you're curious to learn more, you can go to our website, ecofiscal.ca/supporting carbon pricing. So I'll kind of wrap things up there and pivot over to questions. So I'm curious to hear what the audience might like to hear from myself and Chad. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Jason. Just to mention briefly that the answers to the last poll there were predominantly all of the above. So most people preferred to say the whole kit and caboodle. Before we jump into questions, actually, Chad, I'm going to give a brief presentation about the Climate Hub campaign, a very brief 2 minutes or so. What we're doing here with this campaign and this webinar is to set up local groups across the country whose objective is to push their cities along the Federation of Canadian Municipalities 5-milestone framework, consisting of measuring their emissions on an annual basis, using the internationally recognized methodology for doing so, setting a target, an ambitious target aligned with 2 degrees, keeping temperatures within 2 degrees, and aligned with Canada's national targets. Thirdly, setting a plan, and fourthly, implementing that plan, including potentially ecofiscal measures within that. And finally, measuring kind of how that plan stacked up to expectations and restarting the process, measuring inventories, conducting an emissions inventory again, and following the same 5-step process again. So if you're in one of the cities listed on the screen today, please visit climatehub.ca if you haven't already. Sign up, and we can put you in touch with folks in your community. If you are not in one of the cities listed on the screen at the moment, you can also head to climatehub.ca and indicate your interest in starting a group. And when we have a critical mass of people in a city, that's when we'll say, okay, we're going to start putting resources there. We're going to start supporting hubs that are starting in that community. So of the 20 on the screen, there are 8 that are currently active, and the other 12 will be active by the end of the calendar year. So don't worry if you're, for example, in Waterloo or in Winnipeg. We haven't gotten to you yet, but you are next on our horizon. And there are regional organizers on board in BC, the Prairies, and a third in Ontario to help support the rollout of those hubs. So what do the hubs propose? In addition, is to compare each other against and be able to benchmark cities against each other. The first benchmarking report will be released in April of 2018, hopefully around Earth Day. So that's what's coming down the line from us. Please reach out, indicate your interest, and when you do so, we will be able to respond to you and bring you on board with some of the stuff happening in the background as the campaign evolves and as it matures. So thanks very much. I'll skip over that for now. We'll jump to the question period. So I'll ask Chad and Jason to come back online with us there, and I'll stop my screen share. And we've got a couple of questions already, so I'll start with those. And they came from the registration form. If others on the line have questions, you can use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen. You can also feel free to type them right into the chat window, which is also there at the bottom of the screen. So first, let's get to this one. How do you get financing for deep energy retrofits for houses? So would either of you like to speak to the possibility of, I mean, it's not ecofiscal per se, but I mean, I guess there's a way that you could do it, but I'll leave it to you guys to figure that out.
Chad, did you want to start us off, or?
Sure, and it really depends on your jurisdiction. There's a number of ways of getting them. I guess politically it always comes into this. Municipal politics always comes into it. And with the larger the rebate, I have found, it means the larger the amount of money going to a single individual. And you know, toilet replacements or small insulation measures, window replacements, you're talking in the hundreds of dollars. When you get into thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, as in individuals' homes retrofits, that's usually done, in my experience, by the province. And in Alberta now we have this energy efficiency agency that's launched a series of programs as of June, and they're all being funded by a carbon tax. We've been able to offer a number of them associated with relatively small scale renovations within houses, and they're being funded by a version of a carbon tax. It's really us charging the electricity utility for rent for lines running under our street. It comes off an electricity bill and is given to us, and so we decide to give those out in the form of a suite of energy efficiency rebates. So it's large renovations within houses. I think municipalities can really only be expected to pay for a share of those, but it does help people get over that hump of I may own my house for only 5 years, so how much should I invest in it?
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add. I think that last point's really important, that barrier in terms of the homeowner may not be around for the long term. There's also barriers when there's a renter versus a landlord, that maybe neither has enough incentive to invest. So there can be a role for provincial governments, especially provincial governments, when you're talking about large investments. But you also want to be careful that you're not ending up with free riders where you are paying people to make changes they would have anyway. So if it's a matter of saving money on your energy bill, then some of those people might have made those investments anyway in response to a carbon price. So sometimes targeting these types of programs towards lower income households can make sense. So there's a lot of tricky questions around calibration, but it's certainly on the face of it a very good use of carbon pricing revenues to recycle those towards those kind of investments and help them get done.
I think that, you know, again, politically, it's very difficult to fund those with property taxes. So you look for alternative sources that are directly related, whether it be related to energy use, then you take from the many and give to the few. I think that what it's nomenclature, but I think what all of the policies that Jason referenced, and even carbon pricing, is all about sending clear incentives and disincentives, ideally both. When you charge for parking and make transit free, that's very clear disincentive and incentive to the behavior you want. And that's a very direct one, but all of these are discussing sort of similar on different scales, incentive and disincentive for what's better for the municipality, just like charging by volume for your water usage as opposed to a fixed fee for your connection.
Yeah. As capital is relatively inexpensive, the federal and provincial governments can make capital available to municipalities, with which I think they're able to lend money at very low interest to homeowners, and that money is paid back to the municipality in the form of an increased property tax over, amortized over 10 or 15 or 20 years, such that if you undergo a $50,000 renovation, you're only paying $1,500 a year, and it's $125 on your property tax every month, kind of thing. Which means if I sell my house, that bill goes with the house, and it doesn't stay with the person who undertook the initial renovations. So that's an interesting model that I've heard of working. I haven't seen it in place, but have you guys seen that in either Alberta or elsewhere?
No, and that's complicated when a municipality is in the business of lending money. And so I personally would avoid that. That's direct competition with the banks and us getting into the collecting payments that we are not used to collecting. I've heard of it. Toronto Atmospheric Fund, I think, is one. Jason mentioned Vancouver requiring higher building codes, and that's when we get into the required instead of the incentive. And actually, very few municipalities have that power. It's odd, but to override the building code is something that we certainly don't have, and not many municipalities would require more than building code, even if you're requiring more, not less.
Okay.
So lending, I think that there are other ways to incent it.
Okay, great. Okay, question here from Allison. I live within BC and have familiarity with the carbon tax. Can you give an example of how, when, what kind of policy would interact negatively within a carbon tax environment? So at the municipal level, what kind of policies would not be appropriate or could be problematic? Further, I can see what you mean regarding cap and trade, but having a hard time thinking of where a policy might be counterproductive in a carbon tax environment. And I can see some policies are less impactful or cost effective than others, but can you provide an example of where it might be actually counterproductive?
Sure. So I can provide like a bit of a theoretical example. So imagine a industry, oil and gas or something that has kind of a large GHG emissions inventory and faces carbon taxation. So they may decide that they want to respond by, say, scaling back production in this area and focusing on a different plant. They might want to retrofit this plant in such and such a way and that one in a different way. So you could alternatively, in addition to the carbon tax, regulate them, require them to adopt some specific type of technology that would lower their emissions. So that would be, an additional non-pricing climate policy. But in theory, at least, it could get in the way of the most cost-effective intervention that they could have made. Maybe for that plant, it made sense to do, this other type of intervention. But by kind of forcing their hand and requiring them to do this one other thing, you've made that overall GHG mitigation coming from that plant more expensive. So these kinds of really prescriptive technology-specific regulations can actually get in the way not only of the most cost-effective types of policies, technologies, but also innovation. Then you're limiting the incentive that those firms have to figure out for themselves new ways of lowering their emissions. So those sorts of things where it's particularly heavy-handed types of regulations that can potentially get in the way and interact with the carbon price in a way that the carbon tax was going to do that anyway. So you might have just actually made it more expensive than it would have been otherwise.
I'll offer another example that's perhaps more basic, but when a municipality both supports a carbon tax and yet continues to sprawl, then you're sending signals to new suburban dwellers that you need to drive to get to your basic services at the same time as you're charging them more to drive, and not, for example, not providing bike transit opportunities. So that's happening in most Canadian municipalities. I happen to live in one that is growth limited. That's coming from being an island within Banff National Park. But we're limited to 4 square kilometers, so we're not sprawling and yet still trying to provide lots of walk, bike, transit options. So that's one that I often see as counterproductive, is the market pressures of sprawl are leading people to locate in situations where it's difficult to avoid a carbon tax on your fuel.
Thanks. Excellent point, Chad. Thank you for that. Another question here when confronted with slogans like "axe the tax," this is a bit of a softer question, a bit of a kind of communications messaging problem, more than a technical problem. But when confronted with slogans like that, because that's really what we're up against when it comes to the political discourse, how can climate advocates best respond?
So the way that Ecofiscal kind of approaches this often is when kind of discussing or debating with opponents of carbon taxes is first, so sort of, you want to find out, do you kind of accept the science of climate change? So if you're not convinced that there's a problem, then that's probably the debate you need to be having. But if they do accept that the science of climate change is real, then the question becomes, okay, so what's the best way to lower emissions? And so from our perspective, the most economically efficient way to lower emissions is carbon taxes and cap and trade systems. Now, you can use other approaches like regulations and subsidies, but they're typically going to come at a much higher cost to the economy. So kind of having carbon pricing as the bedrock of your climate policy approach is the most economically efficient way. So if not the tax, then what would be our response typically?
Okay, and Chad, when it comes to messaging with effective, kind of cutting, rhyming campaign slogans, anything you can?
It's a political reality. One, another way to put it, I think that is quite acceptable in Canada and even in traditionally conservative Alberta, is user pay. So I get that when I'm going to a swimming pool, I'm going to pay something to use it. And similarly, I hope that people get that when they create waste, there's a user fee associated with it. So it is, it's different phraseology, but the franchise fee that we have on electricity, which we're able to use for a number of different environmental projects, is effectively another tax. And I've got to admit, I lost a lunch bet on whether it would succeed, because it is another tax, but it did get put in place by council. It's not property tax, and that has become very important for me to be able to use some of this money on different projects and policies, is that it's not coming from the general property tax base. It's a user fee on electricity, and that has seemed to make it more politically palatable.
Okay, thanks for that. Maybe a final question before we close out here. Ontario has passed legislation to allow municipalities to loan money to homeowners with payback on taxes over many years. I think this is probably what I was referring to earlier.
Yes.
Local improvement charge, so LIC. So Toronto is doing this at some scale. So yeah, LIC programs are what I was referring to earlier, and so it's being tested, and who knows? I mean, I think the Toronto Atmospheric Fund has done a lot of wonderful things, and I think they've made a good name for themselves. So to the extent to which we're going to see other cities look to emulate that model and some of the policies that they've been successful with remains to be seen. That was a bit of a quick question. Maybe I'll drop one more just as the end here. And this is a personal question because I've been looking into this, and I know that Alexa has as well. But the advent of autonomous vehicles begs the question, with this major change to one of our primary sources of emissions, both electrification of vehicles and autonomy of new vehicles, where does ecofiscal policy, what kinds of policies can help us avoid, for example, a city of driverless or really empty vehicles, circulating because they're going across the city to pick somebody up, but they're moving through, our roadways completely empty?
So it's a really interesting question, and it's funny because on this topic, you hear both sides argue. You hear that, well, all the vehicles are going to drive in sync. You won't have the stop and go as much. That's going to lower emissions. But then you also hear, well, people hate sitting in their cars for an hour at a time, but if they're not driving, they can just sit back. So will people choose to live further now? And will emissions rise as a result? So we actually wrote a blog on this last summer, I think. So if you Google ecofiscal driverless cars, our intern kind of took this on as a passion project. And what the conclusion we kind of arrived at is that it's not the point. The driverless cars are neither something to fear nor be particularly optimistic about. It's whether you have the right policies in place to allow them to kind of not raise emissions and ideally lower emissions. So the kind of three policies that really make sense for making sure driverless cars are helpful is, one, you want to make sure that you've got emissions pricing so that people aren't driving more than they have to. Two, you want to ideally put in place congestion pricing. So we've written a report on this. You want to make sure that people aren't using the roads at the wrong time and jamming them up. And third is sprawl policies. This is something Chad was talking about. Often when suburban developments get put in place, they don't have to pay the development charges of putting all that water and electrical infrastructure out that far. So the extent to which you price that into the development charges that developers have to pay when they're creating these new neighborhoods, that then reflects the cost of living that far out from the city center and building out the urban environment that far. So when you have these kind of ecofiscal policies in place, then you kind of neither have to worry about driverless cars, and there's more room to be kind of encouraged by their potential. So I'm sure Chad has something to add on the sprawl and other parts.
Well, I think that's to a degree in the future for us, but it's good to think about it in the first place and have policies in place. Car share is probably something that's more with us right now, and electric vehicles. So, that's more in this time frame that we're thinking of, and it costs a a municipality and its citizens money to provide parking spaces. It takes up land, and it's never free parking. It's a matter of who pays for it. So I guess that's the potential of some autonomous vehicles and car share, is that you have less parked at any time, and that there's a benefit to that. But I guess I'd still put the autonomous vehicle, whether it be the autonomous vehicle, the electric vehicle, the car shared vehicle, down the hierarchy of ways to get around that we'd like to see. It takes a lot less space to accommodate a pedestrian and a bicyclist. So, back to other policies that we think about, which are related to carbon policy and complementary. Which do you clear first in a winter city? Do you clear the roads first? Or do you clear the sidewalks and the bike paths first? Because you have to make these kind of choices after a snowfall, and that's a very basic policy that citizens can relate to in terms of which you want more of.
Terrific. Thanks so much. We do have one more question, and being that we don't have an exodus of attendees to the door, maybe we'll take it if that's all right with you two. And that being, I just caught it here in the comments, but real focus on carbon budgets, and a focus on carbon budgets that are cumulative and respect really 1.5 degrees. So how can we ensure that ecofiscal policy is constrained within, or how can we ensure that the cap that we set for our economy and the ecofiscal policies that serve that cap are constrained within the scientific boundaries and not, forgive the terminology, but Harper's targets, basically, because right now Canada is on a course set by our previous federal government, and it is a course that is widely recognized as insufficient for keeping the climate crisis within the bounds of what is some consider sustainable for our civilization to continue. So with that in mind, your optimism, pessimism on, can we implement and turn the screws fast enough in order to take an economy that right now is really running beyond its means and really draw it down to the carbon budget necessary? Are carbon budgets part of your discourse in your respective fields? Yeah. A couple questions rolled into one there.
I mean, I can kick it off. So yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, make no mistake, the trajectory that Canada's carbon price rollout has us on, and all the package of policies that currently exist, aren't gonna, as of yet, allow Canada to hit the 2030 target, which is a completely insufficient target if you look at the carbon budget and the safe operating space for the planet and Canada's fair share of that carbon budget. I mean, there's not a lot to say on that front. It's, ideally, we would have climate policy that recognized the bounds for emissions that science laid out for us, and we would work within it. For better or worse, and likely worse, we are kind of stuck by the problem of incrementalism around policy. There's a risk that if we go too hard, too fast on these policies, the pendulum will swing the other way, and the public's appetite for them will decrease, and we'll end up with no climate policies. That's, I mean, it's not very comforting to hear. Personally, the way that I kind of approach this problem is there's a guy, Maurice Strong, who passed a couple of years ago, who's the founder of the United Nations Environment Program, a Canadian diplomat. And when asked this kind of question about how he feels about the climate crisis and dedicating his life's work to it, he said he was analytically pessimistic, operationally optimistic. So that's kind of what I tend to come in on myself. So yeah.
Chad, you want to speak to that?
Well, that's a big question. I just see from my perspective is that the carbon pricing is one of the ways, or municipal policy is one tool, but those alone will not get us to our targets. I think that we often think in municipal world, education, incentive, and then law. And I think that we're going to need some more than voluntary behavioral change on some fronts. And Jason's right. We work in a 4-year democracy window, and policies that aren't popular are difficult to put in. Big, bold leadership.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. I'll ask, if she would like to, I'll ask Alexa to speak to that last question as well, because she is the voice of tomorrow as the youngest member of our panel here. So as she closes out with her conclusion, also, Alexa, are you optimistic? How do you feel about this monumental challenge that lies ahead of us? If you want to weigh in on that. Otherwise, feel free to take it away and take us home.
Well, I must say I'm a little bit biased since I'm studying environmental studies, so most of my friends are like-minded individuals, but I definitely see a shift towards more sustainable practices. And in my experience, people are really making individual decisions, and I think that reflects the vision that this is a problem that faces us all, and that little actions can accumulate into larger initiatives. So I want to thank Jason and Chad for joining us today, and thank you to everyone else who's online right now. We hope you've come away with knowledge and inspiration to get active in your community, and we invite you to sign up to join a hub at climatehub.ca. Our next webinar is on Thursday, October 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and will feature Andrew Gage of West Coast Environmental Law, extending today's topic further and addressing the legal limits of municipal power and recent developments in that field. You can sign up on that same site, climatehub.ca. Thanks again, and hope to see you next week.